What would you do if the man you had loved most in the world was buried on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday evening you were handed $2 and told that was the whole of your inheritance? 20-year-old Margaret Marsh stood at the door of the only home she had ever known with 2 thin coins pressed into her palm and a black armband still damp from the churchyard rain. She was told the house was not hers, the land was not hers, the name over the gate was not hers. But the truth waiting inside a solicitor's dusty ledger would undo every word of it. Settle in. Draw your chair a little closer to the fire. Let us know from where you are watching tonight, and stay with Margaret as she walks the long road back to Willow Creek. The coach set her down at the crossroads before dawn, and the driver did not wait to see whether she had anyone to meet her. She did not. Margaret lifted her small carpet bag with both hands, because one hand was not strong enough for even so little, and she began the walk down the lane toward the village. The hedgerows were black with wet. A crow called once and did not call again. Her boots, mended twice at the heel, took on the mud of the county road within the first quarter-mile. She had left Willow Creek at 13, sent away to a great-aunt in the north after her mother's death, and she had returned only twice in 7 years. Once for a christening she was not invited to stay for, and once, 3 days ago, for the funeral of her father. Thomas Marsh had been a quiet man with careful hands and a cough that had grown roots in him over the last winter. He had not written to her often. When he did, he wrote of the orchard, the slate on the east roof, the mare who was going blind in one eye. He had never once written of a will. At the funeral, her uncle Roland had done the speaking. Roland Marsh was her father's older brother, red-faced, broad in the shoulder, loud in the pew. His wife Hetty had stood at his elbow with a black bonnet pulled down almost to her nose. When the last shovel of earth was patted flat, Roland had turned to Margaret in the lane and pressed the $2 into her hand as if he were paying a servant. "That is your share," he had said. "Your father left debts. The rest is settled." She had opened her mouth and closed it again. She had learned, in 7 years away, that a girl who argued with a man like Roland was a girl who slept in a barn. Now, walking back into the village at first light, she carried those 2 coins in the pocket over her heart. Not because they were dear to her, but because she did not yet know what else to do with them. The chimneys of Willow Creek came into view above the elms. Smoke rose from 3 of them. The rest were cold. Somewhere a rooster gave up on the morning entirely and went quiet. She did not go to her father's house. She could not have borne to knock and be met by Hetty's bonnet. Instead, she turned down the narrow track that ran past the old rectory and stopped at the gate of the country house at the end of the lane. The house her grandfather had built, the house her father had been born in, the house that had stood shuttered and unlent for as long as she could remember. Marsh End, they called it, though no one had painted the name back onto the gate in 20 years. The roof sagged in the middle like a swayback horse. Ivy had eaten the west chimney to the shoulder. One of the front windows was boarded with a plank that had once belonged to a cart. The garden, walled in old brick, had gone to nettles and dock. A single crooked pear tree stood inside the wall with 3 brown fruit still clinging to its branches. Though the season for pears had long since passed, Margaret set her carpet bag on the wet stone of the threshold and looked at the house for a long, still minute. Her uncle had said, at the graveside and again after, that the country house was a ruin and a burden, that her father had signed it over years ago to settle a loan, that it belonged now to the parish, or to Roland, or to no one. The story shifted with the telling. $2, Roland had said. That is your share. The house was not on the list. A woman came up the lane behind her with a milk yoke on her shoulders. She was old, thin as a hedge stake, wrapped in a gray shawl that had been washed until it had no color left. She stopped when she saw Margaret at the gate. Her pails swung once and stilled. "You are Thomas's girl," she said. "I am." The old woman studied her for a slow moment, then looked past her at the house, at the sagged roof and the boarded window and the crooked pear. Her mouth moved, as if tasting something she had not tasted for a long time. "A house remembers its own," she said. "Longer than men do." Margaret turned to answer, but the old woman had already shifted her yoke and was walking on down the lane, her pails knocking softly against her hips, and she did not look back. Margaret stood at the gate a while longer. The wind lifted a corner of the plank in the window and dropped it again. Somewhere inside the walled garden, a bird she could not name gave one short call. $2 in her pocket. A carpetbag at her feet. A ruined house in front of her that everyone in the village would swear was not hers. She reached over the gate and worked the rusted latch until it gave. Now, before she steps through that gate, before the solicitor's ledger is opened, before the truth of what her uncle has done begins to unfold. A small pause. Do you think Margaret should turn back to the coach road and take the 2 coins somewhere warmer? Or push open that gate and sleep tonight under a roof no one believes is hers? What do you think that old woman meant by a house remembering its own? If this story has already caught you, tap the like, leave a word in the comments, and subscribe so you can walk the rest of the lane with her. Because what waits behind that gate is only the first thread, and pulled gently, it will unravel every lie told over her father's grave. Margaret pushed the gate wider and stepped inside. The hinges gave a soft protest, and she was through, standing in the tangled front yard of Marsh End with the sound of the old woman's pails fading down the lane. She did not go to the door. Not yet. She set her carpetbag inside the wall, out of the wind, and closed the gate behind it, and turned back toward the village because $2 would not feed her, and the house had no bread in it. The lane felt longer walking back. The mud had thickened. Her boots made a dull suck at each step. Willow Creek's High Street was waking. Shutters were being drawn back. A boy was sweeping the step of the bakery. A woman in a green apron was setting out a basket of onions and stopped mid-motion when she saw Margaret pass. Word had already run. Word ran faster than any coach in a village this size. The woman leaned in at her neighbor's door and said something behind her hand. And the neighbor looked, and looked away, and looked again. Margaret kept her eyes on the cobbles. She had learned that trick years ago in the north, at her great-aunt's table, when neighbors came to peer at the orphan girl. If you did not meet the eye tired first. At the grocer's, she laid one of the coins on the counter and asked for bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and a candle. The grocer was a thin, bald man with ink on his fingers. He looked at the coin as if it might be counterfeit, then at her face. "You are Thomas's girl," he said. "I am." "Roland said you had gone north again." "I have not." He weighed the cheese slowly. He gave her less than the coin was worth, and she did not argue. Behind her, 2 women had come in and were pretending to examine a jar of pickled beets, and were not examining anything at all. "Poor thing," one murmured. "Nothing to her name. Nothing at all." "Sleeping where, do you suppose?" "The barn at Roland's, if he'll have her." "He won't. Hetty won't." Margaret gathered her bread and her cheese and her candle and walked out with her back straight. At the corner by the churchyard wall, a broad, red-faced shape stepped out from under the yew, and there was Roland Marsh in his Sunday coat, with a riding crop tucked under his arm, though he had not ridden anywhere. "Girl," he said. "Not niece, girl. You were meant to be on the northbound. I was not on it. I see that." He looked her up and down, from the mended boots to the damp black armband, and his mouth pulled to one side. "There is nothing for you here, Margaret. You have your share. You have been given more than your father left, if the truth be told. Do not embarrass yourself walking these lanes as if you are owed a bed." "I am owed nothing," Margaret said quietly. "Good. Then you understand." "I understand you," she said. Something in the phrasing caught him. He blinked. Then he laughed, a short, loud laugh that turned two heads at the pump across the square. "Listen to her. 7 years in the north and she comes back with a tongue. Go on then, sleep in a ditch if you like. You will be on tomorrow's coach when the cold has taught you sense." He tipped his hat in a way that was not courtesy and walked past her toward the tavern, and the women at the pump watched him go and then watched her, and did not offer a word. Margaret walked back down the lane to Marsh End with her bread and her cheese and her candle held against her chest, and did not let herself cry until she was inside her own gate again. By then the light had begun to thin. A gray afternoon was giving over to a grayer evening, and a slow rain had started, more mist than weather, that beaded on the wool of her sleeves and would not shake off. Margaret stood before the door of Marsh End and set her hand flat against the wood. It was oak, thick, warped at the bottom where damp had swelled it. The lock had given up years ago. The door pushed inward with a low groan, and the smell of the inside came out to meet her. Cold plaster, mouse, old smoke, and under all of it, the ghost of pipe tobacco that had been her grandfather's, though she could not have known it by name. She stepped into a hall floored with flagstone. Dust lay on everything like gray flour. A staircase climbed on her right with a broken baluster halfway up. To her left, a parlor with its shutters closed, and a single high-backed chair turned to face the empty hearth, as if someone had risen from it a minute ago. Margaret went from room to room slowly, touching nothing, saying nothing. Kitchen with a cold range and a cracked stone sink. A pantry with 3 tin canisters and a jar of something that had once been jam. A back scullery with a copper turned green. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms, 2 with beds still in them under gray sheets that had been sheets once and were now spider country. She chose the smallest room, at the back, above the scullery, because it had the least broken window, and because a bird had built no nest in the chimney. She lit her candle with a match from the tin in her carpet bag. She ate half the bread and a corner of the cheese, sitting on the edge of the bed frame with the candle on the floor beside her boot. She did not lie down for a long time. She listened. The house talked. Old houses do. A beam settled somewhere over her head. A shutter tapped once against its frame in the front room. Rain touched the slate above her in a slow, soft rhythm that was almost a hand patting a child to sleep. Down in the walled garden, that same unnamed bird gave its short call again, and was answered by nothing. Margaret lay down at last on the bare mattress in her coat, with her carpet bag under her head, and the 2 coins still in the pocket over her heart. She did not sleep at once. She stared up at the low sloped ceiling and listened to the house breathe around her, and thought of Roland's short laugh, and of the old woman with the milk yoke, and of her father's careful hands folded on the coffin lid. A house remembers its own. She did not know yet what the words meant, but somewhere below her, in a room she had not yet entered, under a floorboard she had not yet lifted, the ledger her father had never mentioned in any letter waited quietly in the dark. She slept in pieces. Sometime in the deep of the night she woke without knowing why and lay listening with her breath held. The rain had stopped. The house was quieter than before, and it was that quiet that had woken her. Then she heard it, a slow, deliberate tap. Not the shutter, not a beam. A tap, a pause, another tap, coming from somewhere beneath her, as though a knuckle were knocking on wood from the wrong side of a floor. She counted to 20. It did not come again. She told herself it was a rat, or the house cooling, or her own tired mind writing stories against the dark. And she rolled onto her side and pretended to sleep until the pretending became the thing itself. She woke at first light with a stiff neck and a cat on her feet. The cat was old, gray with a white throat, and had one torn ear that had healed crooked. It looked at her with the patient boredom of a creature that had been waiting some while. Margaret did not move. The cat blinked slowly, then began to wash a paw. She did not know how it had got in. There were, she supposed, 100 ways into a house like Marsh End, and none of them her business to close today. She sat up, and the cat did not leave. It followed her down the stairs a step behind, silent on the boards, and sat in the hall while she opened the shutters one by one. Light came into the parlor in pale gray bars. The dust rose and turned in it. She stood in the middle of the room and looked, properly this time, with morning in her favor. That was when she saw it. Above the parlor hearth, set into the plaster, was a small carved wooden shield the size of her hand. It had been painted once and the paint had gone. In the center of the shield, cut cleanly and deep, was a single letter M. Around the M, in a smaller, careful hand, someone had cut a date. 1841. Margaret stood a long while and looked at it. Marsh, she thought. Of course. But it was the date that would not sit. Her grandfather had built the house in 1822. Her father had been born in it in 1829. 1841 was the year her father had married her mother. It was not a building date. It was not a birth date. It was a claim date. Someone had marked this house in her father's own year, and no one had ever mentioned it. Not in any letter. Not in any funeral speech. Not once in Roland's quick catalogue of debts and settlements. She did not touch it. She stepped back. The cat, still sitting in the doorway, gave a single flick of its tail. Margaret looked at the carved M for one more slow moment, then turned away as though she had seen nothing at all. Some clues she had learned already in her 20 years needed to be left in the corner of the eye. Bring them into full sight too soon, and they took fright and went. She went to work instead. Work was the thing she had been taught in the North, and work was the thing the house needed, and the two suited each other well enough. She fetched a pail from the scullery, cracked the ice of last week off the yard pump with the heel of her boot, and drew water until her right arm ached, and her left, the weaker one, trembled at the elbow. She scrubbed the flagstones of the hall on her knees, and where the grime lifted, she found the stone beneath to be a warm honey color she had not expected. She swept the parlor with a broom whose bristles were half gone. She carried out 3 armfuls of nesting straw from the kitchen chimney and burned it in the yard. The cat watched from the doorstep with its paws folded under its chest. By noon, she had eaten the second half of the bread and drunk water from the pump, and the house smelled less like mouse and more like wet stone, which she counted an improvement. She pulled the gray sheets from the beds upstairs and hung them over the walled garden wall to air, though the air was cold and damp and would do them small favor. Under one of the sheets, she found a folded quilt, moth-eaten at one corner, with her mother's small, tight stitching along the binding. She sat on the edge of the bed and held it for a long minute. and did not weep, because weeping was for evenings, and it was still only noon. She worked on. In the scullery she scoured the green copper with sand from the yard until a coin of true copper showed through, and then a larger patch, and then the whole side of it caught the afternoon light and threw a warm red back at her. In the kitchen she opened the range, cleaned the flue with a bundle of wire and rag, and laid a small fire from broken laths and a handful of coal she found in a scuttle behind the door. When the fire caught, the cat came in without being asked and lay down on the hearthstone as though it had done so every day of its life. While the fire burned, Margaret went into the parlor again. She was not going for the shield. She was going, she told herself, for the high-backed chair, which needed dragging closer to the hearth for its own good. But her hand, moving along the wainscoting to steady her as she pulled the chair, found something the mind had not asked it to look for. A panel that gave a little. Just a little. A hair's breadth of give where the rest of the wall was solid. She pressed it, and it pressed back the wrong way. She did not force it. She stood back, marked the place in her memory by the third rose in the plaster cornice above it, and went back to the chair. By dusk she had cleaned 3 rooms, cleared the front step of moss, mended one shutter with twine, and set a pot of water on the range to boil for the tea she did not have. Her hands were raw, her knees ached, her hair had come down twice and been pinned up twice with the same iron pin. The cat had moved 4 times, always to the room she was working in, always at a distance that was neither company nor solitude but the exact middle thing. She stood in the hall at the end of that first day and looked at what she had done. It was not much. A house like Marsh End would take a season, a year, longer. But the flagstones shone dully in the last light from the open door, and the copper glowed in the scullery, and the fire in the range gave a small living sound behind her, and above the parlor hearth, in the dimming gray, the carved M waited without hurry for her to be ready to ask it what it meant. She was ready 2 mornings later. By then the fire had held through a second night, the pantry had been swept, and the cat had accepted a saucer of water at the hearthstone, as if it had always been offered there. Margaret rose before dawn, put on her coat, and went into the parlor with the candle in one hand and a flat iron file she had found rusting in the scullery drawer in the other. The rose in the plaster cornice waited above her, 3rd from the corner, as she had marked it. She knelt to the panel. In candlelight the seam showed itself faintly, a hair of shadow that ran the height of a book and the width of a hand. She set the file against the seam, not to prize but to test, and the panel gave again, that same wrong-way press, as if a spring behind it had gone soft with years but still remembered its work. She tried the other side. She tried the top. At the bottom corner her thumb found a small iron nub set flush with the wood, the head of it worn smooth as a river stone. She pressed it. Something inside the wall let go with a small dry click, and the panel swung an inch out toward her hand. She did not open it further at once. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. The cat came in behind her and sat. Margaret drew the panel open with 2 fingers. The candle showed a cavity behind the wainscot no deeper than a hymn book, lined with tin to keep the damp out. Inside the tin lining lay 3 things: a flat brass strongbox, no larger than a family Bible, a bundle of letters tied with faded green tape, and beneath both, filling the base of the cavity like a dark loaf, a leather ledger with a plain black cover and no title on its spine. She lifted the ledger first because her hands went to it before she thought. The leather was cold. She carried it to the parlor hearth, set the candle on the flagstone, and opened the cover. The first page was her grandfather's hand. She knew it from an old birthday card kept for years in a drawer up north. Below his signature, in her father's neater, smaller writing, was a single line dated the spring after her mother's death. Marsh End, and all its lands within the wall, is hereby settled upon my daughter Margaret Marsh, sole and entire, to hold from her 13th year and after. Below that, a witness signature she did not know, and the seal of a Willow Creek solicitor pressed into red wax so old it had crazed like a dry pond. She turned pages. Rents from a tenant farmer for a strip of orchard land. A yearly account of pear crop and hay. A small column marked for M, growing coin by coin over 7 years, never touched. She read the sums twice. They were not a fortune. They were enough that a girl might live a year and mend her boots. She opened the strongbox next. Inside lay the original deed, folded thrice, and beneath it, her mother's wedding ring, wrapped in a scrap of linen, with her own baby name pinned to it in her father's hand. Margaret did not weep. She sat very still on the flagstone with the ledger open across her knees and the ring cold in her palm, and the candle burned steadily beside her boot, and the gray cat put its forehead against her ankle and left it there. Outside, the first thrush of the morning began its slow calling from the walled garden, and for the first time in 7 years Margaret Marsh understood that her father had not forgotten her. She read the letters last, in the order they had been tied. The wind came up that same afternoon out of the west, low at first, and then rising, and by evening it had turned to true weather. Rain drove sideways against the boarded window. A slate lifted somewhere on the east roof and went down into the yard with a flat clap. The candle bent and steadied. Margaret closed the panel, put the ledger and strongbox and letters inside her carpet bag, and buckled it. At the height of the storm, someone struck the door with the flat of a hand. She thought first of Roland. She lifted the iron poker from beside the range and went into the hall in her stockinged feet. The knocking came again, weaker. A voice under it, a woman's, and behind the woman a child crying the small, exhausted cry of a child who has been crying a long while already. Margaret opened the door. On the step stood a young woman she did not know, soaked to the collarbone, holding a boy of perhaps 4 against her shoulder. The woman's shawl was black with wet. Her lip was split. Behind her, the lane ran with water, and the hedgerow bent low. She said only, "Please." Then, "The bridge is down. My husband is at the mill." Then nothing. Margaret stepped aside. "Come in." She brought them to the kitchen, set them by the range, and hung the shawl on a nail by the flue. The boy would not let go of his mother's neck. Margaret cut the last of the bread into small pieces on the hearthstone, warmed water in the copper pan she had scoured 2 days before, and made a thin sop with a corner of the cheese melted through it. The woman ate a spoonful and gave the rest to the child. Margaret said nothing about the split lip. The storm worked at the house through the long hours. A shutter tore free upstairs, and Margaret went up with the twine and lashed it back. Water came in at the east chimney, and she set the copper under the drip. The cat stayed on the hearthstone with the boy's foot against its flank. The woman slept, sitting up with her arms locked around the child. Near midnight, the door was struck a second time. Hard, 3 blows with a stick. Roland's voice came through the wood, wet and furious, calling her name and calling the woman's, saying he had followed the tracks up from the lane, saying the woman was to come out now and the boy with her, saying the house was not Margaret's to shelter anyone in. Margaret set the poker across the inside of the door and drew the bolt her father had oiled at some quiet hour years before her. She spoke through the wood in a voice that surprised her by not shaking. They stay till morning. Roland struck the door again. It held. He shouted a while longer into the rain, and then the shouting moved off down the lane and was taken by the wind. Margaret stood with her forehead against the wood until she was certain, and then she went back to the kitchen and put another lath on the fire. And she did not sleep that night. And she did not once, through any hour of it, let go of the handle of the carpet-bag at her feet. Morning came gray and washed clean. The rain had gone before dawn and left the lane a slow brown river with leaves stranded in every hoof-print. Margaret opened the door onto a yard scattered with slate and broken twig, and the world smelled of turned earth. The young woman woke at the sound of the bolt and reached first for the boy. Margaret set water to warm and did not speak until the woman had drunk. The woman said her name was Anne Hale, and her husband was Peter at the mill. Margaret said she would walk with her down to see if the bridge could be crossed on foot. They did not need to walk far. Peter Hale was already coming up the lane with a lantern still lit against the last of the dark. And behind him were 3 men from the mill and the grocer with ink on his fingers, and at the back, a thin figure in a black coat whom Margaret did not know. Peter took the boy from Anne without a word, and held him so tight the child squeaked. Then he turned to Margaret, and could not speak at all. He took off his cap and held it against his chest. The thin man in the black coat stepped forward. He was perhaps 50, with spectacles pushed up onto his forehead and mud to the knee of his trousers. He said his name was Mr. Alden, that he had come out from the county seat on the first coach after the storm because a letter of his had been sitting these 7 years unanswered, and that he was the solicitor who had drawn a certain settlement in the spring after her mother's death. He said it quietly, with his hat in his hand, as if he did not wish to be overheard by the lane. Margaret brought him inside. She set the ledger on the kitchen table and laid the deed beside it and the letters in their green tape on top. Mr. Alden put his spectacles back onto his nose and read for a long time without speaking. The cat sat on the corner of the table and did not move. At last Mr. Alden folded his hands on the ledger and said plainly, "This is in order. It was always in order." He said Thomas Marsh had come to his office the March after her mother's burial and had signed the settlement, and that a copy sat in his own safe in town, and that no transfer out of her name had ever crossed his desk or any other desk in the county because none had ever been made. He said the small column marked for M had been paid in each year by the tenant on the orchard strip, and that the sum was hers, and had been hers since her 13th birthday. He said he was sorry it had taken a storm to bring him up the lane. Roland came at midday. He came without the riding crop and without the Sunday coat, in a plain wool jacket wet at the shoulders, and he stood in the yard and did not go through the gate. Hetty was not with him. Behind him, at a careful distance, stood the woman in the green apron and the boy from the bakery step, and the 2 women who had examined the pickled beets, and the old woman with the milk yoke, her pails set down in the mud beside her boots. They did not laugh. They did not whisper. They stood as a churchyard stands. Mr. Alden went out to Roland with the deed folded in his hand. He spoke quietly, so that Margaret from the doorway heard only the shape of it. The settlement, the date, the seal, the tenant's rents held in account, the matter of what Roland had told the girl at the graveside. Roland's face went from red to a color Margaret had not seen on him before, a pale gray like the underside of a leaf. He did not shout. He looked once at Margaret across the yard, and then down at his own boots. He said, loud enough for the lane to hear, "I did not know it stood in her name." Mr. Alden said, "You had 7 years to ask." Roland did not answer that. He turned and walked back down the lane, and the chorus at the gate parted to let him pass and closed again behind him without a word. The old woman with the milk yoke came forward then and set a pail of fresh milk inside the gate and said, "For the child." She looked once at Margaret and said, "The house remembered." Then she took up her yoke and went on. By afternoon others came. The grocer brought a loaf and would not take a coin for it. The bakery boy brought a paper of currants from his mother. Peter Hale brought a bundle of dry laths cut to length for the range, and a promise of a man to look at the east roof before the next rain. Anne Hale sat by the hearth with the boy asleep across her lap and would not go home yet, and Margaret did not ask her to. Mr. Alden stayed until the last light to help her count what was owed and what was hers, and when he left, he shook her hand as one shakes the hand of a person one has underestimated and will not underestimate again. That evening, Margaret walked out alone into the walled garden. The sky had cleared to a pale gold at the western wall and blue above, and the wet brick held the last warmth of the day. The crooked pear tree still carried its 3 brown fruits. She stood beneath it with her hands loose at her sides and her hair down and her boots muddy to the ankle. From the kitchen door, the cat watched her with its torn ear lifted. From beyond the wall, a thrush sang once and once again, and then went quiet, as if satisfied. Margaret thought of her father's hands folded on the coffin lid and the 2 coins she had carried in the pocket over her heart, still there, warm now against the cloth. She thought of the panel behind the wainscot and the letter M cut deep into the plaster shield and the year 1841 around it, and of the small column in the ledger growing coin by coin for 7 silent years. She thought of Roland's face going the color of a leaf's underside, and of the old woman saying the house remembered. Anne Hale came to the garden door with a shawl over her shoulders and asked if Margaret wanted the fire built up. Margaret said yes in a moment. Anne waited, because she did not yet know how to leave a house that had held her through a storm, and Margaret was glad of her waiting. She looked once more at the pear tree and the wall and the roof sagging like a swayback horse against the gold sky, and she said, more to herself than to Anne, "I was not left nothing. I was left this, and myself to keep it." Anne heard her, and nodded once, and went back inside to lay the fire. Margaret stood a moment longer in the last of the light. The gate at the lane end stood open. Somewhere a cart went by, and the sound of it was ordinary, and belonged to the evening, and to her. Thank you for staying with Margaret to the end of this quiet road, for walking a story about the small, stubborn courage of holding on to what the world tells you is nothing. If this tale warmed the room where you sit, leave a like, a comment about where you're watching from, and subscribe so the next story finds you. There is another waiting at the top of another muddy lane, and we will meet you there.